In a world that often seems divided, sometimes the simplest acts of kindness can bridge the deepest gaps and reveal the beautiful connections that bind us all together. This is a story about how a casual wave across the fence turned into something extraordinary, proving that the best neighbors don't just live next door, they become family. Sarah noticed him the day she moved into her new home in the quiet suburban neighborhood. An elderly gentleman, probably in his mid-80s, meticulously tending to his rose garden despite his trembling hands. Living alone as a busy professional in her 30s, she hadn't expected to form any deep connections in her new community. But there was something about the way he carefully pruned each stem that touched her heart. It started with small gestures, bringing in his mail when she noticed it piling up, offering to shovel his driveway after heavy snowfall, or simply sharing her homemade Sunday dinners. Mr. Thompson, as she came to know him, was initially hesitant to accept help from his new neighbor. But Sarah's genuine warmth and persistent kindness gradually melted the walls of isolation that had built up around him since his wife's passing 5 years ago. Their friendship blossomed over steaming cups of coffee on his porch, where he would share stories about his life as a high school history teacher and his travels across the country with his late wife. Sarah found herself looking forward to these conversations, discovering wisdom and perspective in his gentle words that she hadn't expected to find in her new neighborhood. But it wasn't until that rainy Tuesday evening when everything changed. Sarah had rushed over with an umbrella after seeing Mr. Thompson struggling with his groceries in the downpour. As they sorted his purchases in his kitchen, a weathered photo album fell from the top shelf. The pages flew open, revealing a familiar face that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. There, in a faded photograph from the 1960s, stood a young woman who looked remarkably like Sarah's grandmother, the same warm smile, the same determined eyes. As Mr. Thompson carefully picked up the scattered photos, his hands trembled not from age but from emotion. "That's from my first year of teaching," he said softly, his voice thick with memory. The connection that was about to be revealed would prove that their paths had crossed long before Sarah moved in next door. The story hidden within those yellowed photographs would challenge everything they thought they knew about coincidence and fate. It would show how small acts of kindness can echo through generations, coming full circle in the most unexpected ways. As rain drummed against the windows and lightning illuminated the kitchen, Mr. Thompson began to share a story that would change both their lives forever. It was a tale of courage, friendship, and hope during one of America's most challenging periods. A story that had been waiting decades to be told, connecting two families across time through an unbreakable bond of compassion and understanding. But before Mr. Thompson could reveal the full truth about the woman in the photograph, Sarah noticed his hands shaking more than usual. The weight of the memories seemed to overwhelm him, and he needed a moment to collect himself. The silence that filled the kitchen was heavy with anticipation, leaving both of them wondering how their simple neighbor relationship had led them to this profound moment of discovery. What Sarah would learn next would not only reshape her understanding of her family's history, but would also remind us all that the most powerful connections often come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes, the person living just next door might hold the missing pieces to a puzzle we didn't even know we were trying to solve. Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, his weathered hands steadying as he carefully turned the pages of the photo album. "Your grandmother," he began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "was the bravest person I ever met." Sarah leaned forward, her heart racing as she realized this wasn't just going to be another neighborly chat over coffee. The photograph showed a group of teachers standing on the steps of Lincoln High School in 1963. Among them was Sarah's grandmother, standing tall and proud, the first black teacher at what had been, until then, an all-white school. Mr. Thompson explained how, as a young teacher himself, he had witnessed her unwavering dignity in the face of daily challenges that would have broken a lesser spirit. She never lost her smile, he remembered, pointing to another photograph where her grandmother stood in front of a classroom. Even when some parents pulled their children from her class, even when her car tires were slashed in the parking lot, she showed up every day with that same warm smile and determination to make a difference. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her grandmother had rarely spoken about those days, and now here was a living witness to this crucial chapter of her family's history. She had heard fragments of stories during family gatherings, but never the full picture. Her grandmother had passed away when Sarah was just 16, taking many of her stories with her. Mr. Thompson carefully extracted a folded piece of paper from between the album's pages. It was a yellowed newspaper clipping featuring her grandmother receiving a Teaching Excellence Award. "Your grandmother didn't just teach history," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "She made history. She changed minds and hearts, one student at a time." As thunder rolled outside, Mr. Thompson revealed how he and Sarah's grandmother had formed an unlikely alliance in those turbulent times. They would meet early each morning in the teacher's lounge, sharing coffee and strategies for reaching struggling students. While other teachers kept their distance, he saw in her what he hoped to be as an educator, someone who could look past the surface and see the potential in every child. But there was more to the story than just professional respect. Mr. Thompson's hands began trembling again as he reached for another photo, this one carefully preserved in a protective sleeve. Before he could show it to Sarah, a loud crash of thunder caused them both to jump, and the lights flickered ominously. "Maybe we should save the rest for another time," Sarah suggested, noticing how drained Mr. Thompson looked. But he shook his head, clutching the protected photograph closer. "No, you need to see this. You need to understand why your grandmother's kindness saved more than just careers that year. It saved lives." The weight of his words hung in the air as he struggled to find the right way to continue. Sarah could see that whatever came next wasn't just about school integration or professional partnerships. There was something deeper, something personal that had haunted her elderly neighbor for decades. Lightning illuminated the kitchen again, casting dramatic shadows across Mr. Thompson's face as he carefully began to remove the photograph from its protective covering. His hands shook not from age, but from the emotion of what he was about to reveal. Sarah held her breath, knowing that whatever was captured in that image would forever change her understanding of not only her grandmother's legacy, but also her own unexpected connection to the kind man who had become so much more than just a neighbor. What Sarah was about to learn would reveal how deeply intertwined their families' histories truly were, and how a single act of courage during America's civil rights movement had set in motion a chain of events that would echo through generations, leading right to this moment in Mr. Thompson's kitchen. The protected photograph trembled in Mr. Thompson's hands as he finally revealed it to Sarah. Her breath caught in her throat. The image showed her grandmother standing protectively next to a young white girl who couldn't have been more than 7 or 8 years old. The child was clutching a book to her chest, and despite the black and white image, Sarah could see tears streaming down her face. "That little girl," Mr. Thompson said, his voice barely above a whisper, "was my daughter, Rachel." He paused, collecting himself before continuing. "Your grandmother didn't just stake my career that year. She saved my family." Sarah noticed how his fingers traced the edge of the photograph with a gentleness that spoke of years of gratitude. The story unfolded like a carefully preserved letter finally being read. In 1963, Mr. Thompson's wife had fallen seriously ill, leaving him to care for their young daughter alone while trying to maintain his teaching position. Rachel, overwhelmed by her mother's absence and the tension at school, had stopped speaking altogether. The school administration was pushing for her to be sent to a special institution, claiming she needed professional help they couldn't provide. "But your grandmother," Mr. Thompson continued, his eyes bright with memory, "she saw something different. While everyone else was writing Rachel off as a problem child, she saw a little girl drowning in grief." He explained how her grandmother would spend her lunch breaks reading to Rachel in the school library, creating a safe space where words weren't necessary for understanding. Sarah listened, spellbound as Mr. Thompson described how her grandmother had stood before the school board, defending both Rachel's right to remain in regular classes and Mr. Thompson's ability to be both a teacher and a single parent. It was almost unheard of in those days, a black woman standing up for a white colleague and his child, risking her own precarious position in the process. Thunder crashed outside as Mr. Thompson reached for another photograph, this one even more carefully preserved than the last. "Before I show you this," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, "you need to understand something. What your grandmother did next went against every social norm of the time. It could have cost her everything, her job, her reputation, maybe even her life. Sarah's heart pounded as she watched him slowly begin to reveal the photograph. The kitchen lights flickered again, longer this time, threatening to plunge them into darkness. Through the window, she could see the storm intensifying, matching the growing tension in the room. Your grandmother's actions that day, Mr. Thompson continued, his hands shaking more visibly now, set off a chain of events that would change not just Rachel's life, but the entire community's perspective. But there were those who couldn't accept what she did, what we all did, and the consequences. His voice trailed off as he struggled with the weight of the memory. Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fixed on the photograph that was now halfway out of its protective sleeve. Even from this partial view, she could tell it was taken at some kind of gathering. There were crowds of people, some with expressions of joy, others with unmistakable anger. Whatever happened that day had clearly divided the community. Just as Mr. Thompson was about to fully reveal the photograph and continue his story, the lights went out completely, plunging them into darkness. The only illumination came from occasional flashes of lightning, each burst revealing the tears now flowing freely down Mr. Thompson's face. In that moment, Sarah knew she was about to learn something that would forever change her understanding of both her grandmother's legacy and the true cost of courage in the face of hatred. The secret captured in that final photograph would reveal not just how their families were connected, but how one woman's bravery had sparked a transformation that would ripple through generations. As they sat in the darkness, waiting for the lights to return, Sarah could feel the weight of history pressing down on them both, demanding that this story finally be told in full. In the darkness of Mr. Thompson's kitchen, Sarah's phone provided just enough light for them to see each other's faces. She watched as her elderly neighbor wiped away his tears with a trembling hand, then carefully set down the partially revealed photograph on the table between them. "We should wait for the power to come back," she suggested softly, but Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, you need to hear this now, especially with what's happening in our community today," he said, his voice growing stronger. "You see, your grandmother didn't just help Rachel find her voice again. She did something that, in 1963, seemed impossible. She brought together two grieving families and helped them heal each other." Mr. Thompson revealed how Rachel had finally spoken her first words in months, not to him or her doctors, but to Sarah's grandmother in that quiet library corner. The words were simple, "Please don't go," but they changed everything. It turned out Rachel had been terrified of losing another person she'd grown to trust, just as she'd lost her mother. "But here's what few people knew," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Your grandmother was fighting her own private battle at the time." He pulled out another photograph, this one from his wallet, worn and creased from years of careful preservation. In the dim light of Sarah's phone, she could make out her grandmother sitting in a hospital room, looking exhausted but smiling, next to a young man in a military uniform. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She had never seen this photo before, had never known about any military connection in her family. "That's your Uncle James, your grandmother's only brother," Mr. Thompson explained. "He'd been injured in service, and she was secretly traveling 3 hours each way every weekend to care for him, all while teaching full-time and facing those daily challenges at school." The revelation hit Sarah like a physical force. Her grandmother had never mentioned a brother, and her parents had never spoken of an Uncle James. Before she could ask why, Mr. Thompson pulled out yet another document, a yellowed letter that made his hands shake even more than before. "This letter arrived at the school one day," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Someone had discovered your grandmother's hospital visits and twisted the truth, claiming she was participating in civil rights meetings disguised as hospital visits. They threatened to expose her, which would have meant immediate dismissal and possibly worse in those days." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the letter's threatening words still visible after all these years. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the danger her grandmother had faced. But before Mr. Thompson could continue, they heard a sharp knock at the front door. Through the window, they could see a figure standing on the porch, illuminated by occasional lightning flashes. Mr. Thompson's face showed recognition, then concern. "That's Rachel," he said softly. "She must have seen your car in the driveway. She's been wanting to tell you something for weeks now, ever since she discovered who you were." Sarah's mind raced. Rachel, the little girl from the photograph, was here? The same Rachel who had found her voice again through her grandmother's kindness. As Mr. Thompson slowly rose to answer the door, Sarah noticed him carefully folding away the mysterious final photograph they still hadn't fully examined. "Before I let her in," Mr. Thompson said, pausing at the door, "there's something you need to know about why Rachel's here tonight. It's about a promise your grandmother made to both our families. A promise that's about to change everything again." The knock came again, more urgent this time, as thunder rolled overhead and Sarah felt herself holding her breath, knowing that whatever came next would complete a circle that had begun long before she was born. As Mr. Thompson opened the door, a woman in her mid-60s stepped inside, her silver hair glistening with raindrops. Sarah immediately recognized her eyes. They were the same as those of the little girl clutching the book in the old photograph. Rachel's gaze met Sarah's, and for a moment no one spoke. The weight of 60 years of history filled the room. "I was hoping you'd be here tonight," Rachel said softly, her voice carrying the same gentle tone as her father's. "When Dad told me who you were, who your grandmother was to us, I knew we had to finally share everything." She placed a leather briefcase on the kitchen table, her hands steady despite the emotion in her voice. Mr. Thompson finally revealed the last photograph he'd been protecting. In the dim light from Sarah's phone, she could see it showed a private ceremony in her grandmother's backyard. There was her grandmother, standing proud despite obvious exhaustion, next to Mr. Thompson, Rachel, and a man in a wheelchair, Uncle James. They were all smiling, but it was the document they were holding that caught Sarah's attention. "Your grandmother did something extraordinary that day," Rachel explained, opening her briefcase. "When the school board threatened to expose her hospital visits and fire her, she didn't back down. Instead, she invited the superintendent to come with her one weekend." Rachel pulled out a newspaper article that had yellowed with age. The headline read, "Local Teachers' Act of Courage Unites Community." It turned out that Uncle James had been helping other veterans at the hospital, regardless of their race, creating a secret support group that crossed racial boundaries, something unheard of at the time. The superintendent, whose own son had recently returned from service, was so moved by what he witnessed that he became an unexpected ally. "But that's not why we're here tonight," Mr. Thompson said, his voice growing stronger. He reached for the final document in Rachel's briefcase, a deed to a property. "Your grandmother and I made a pact that day. We promised that someday our families would finish what we started." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the deed. It was for a large piece of land on the outskirts of town, jointly owned by both families. "For 60 years, we've been waiting for the right moment," Rachel explained, her eyes shining. "Your grandmother knew that someday our community would be ready for what she envisioned, a place where people could heal together, just like James helped those veterans, just like she helped me find my voice again." Thunder crashed outside as Rachel revealed the architectural plans she'd been working on for months, a community center and healing garden dedicated to bringing people together across all divides. The design incorporated elements from both families' histories. A library corner like the one where Sarah's grandmother had helped Rachel, a veterans' support space inspired by Uncle James, and gardens similar to the ones Mr. Thompson still tenderly maintained. But the final surprise came when Rachel pulled out one last document. "Your grandmother left this for you," she said softly, handing Sarah an envelope. Inside was a letter, written in her grandmother's familiar handwriting, dated just weeks before she passed away. As Sarah began to read, tears rolled down her cheeks. "My dearest Sarah," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you finally met the family that helped me as much as I helped them. What happened in 1963 wasn't just about breaking down barriers. It was about building bridges that would last generations. The land belongs to both our families because healing happens best when we do it together. I knew someday you would understand, and more importantly, you would know what to do next." As the power finally flickered back on, Sarah looked up at Rachel and Mr. Thompson, seeing in their eyes the same hope and determination she had always admired in her grandmother's photographs. The storm outside was beginning to pass, and through the kitchen window, She could see the first hints of dawn breaking through the clouds. In that moment, Sarah understood that this wasn't just a story about the past. It was a blueprint for the future, one that her grandmother had carefully laid out for them to discover exactly when they needed it most. 1 year later, Sarah stood in the center of a bustling crowd, watching as Mr. Thompson, with Rachel by his side, cut the ribbon to officially open the Unity Gardens Community Center. The autumn sun painted the scene in warm golden light, much like the day captured in that old photograph of her grandmother's backyard ceremony. The center had become more than just a building. It was a living testament to how a simple act of kindness could echo through generations. The library corner, now named Grace's Reading Room after Sarah's grandmother, was filled with children of all backgrounds sharing stories together. The Veterans Support Center, dedicated to Uncle James's memory, had already become a sanctuary for service members seeking understanding and healing. Mr. Thompson's rose garden surrounded the building, each carefully tended bed telling its own story. The white roses represented Rachel finding her voice again. The yellow ones honored Sarah's grandmother's courage, and the red ones stood for Uncle James's sacrifice and service. Together, they created a rainbow of resilience and hope. Sarah watched as Mr. Thompson, now using a walker but still insisting on tending to his beloved roses, shared gardening tips with a group of eager youngsters. His hands might have grown shakier, but his ability to nurture growth, both in plants and people, remained as strong as ever. Rachel had taken charge of the center's educational programs, creating a space where children could learn about history not just through books, but through the living stories of their community. She often spoke about how one teacher's kindness had changed not only her life, but had created ripples that continued to touch lives decades later. The most powerful moment came when a local high school student, researching the civil rights movement, discovered the threatening letter that had been sent to Sarah's grandmother. Instead of hiding this painful piece of history, they displayed it in the center's museum section, not as a reminder of hatred, but as proof that courage and love could overcome fear and division. Sarah found herself spending more and more time at the center, drawn by the way it brought people together just as her grandmother had envisioned. She'd watched veterans finding comfort in sharing their stories, children discovering the joy of reading in a safe space, and neighbors from different backgrounds forming unexpected friendships over shared gardening plots. One evening, as the sun set behind the center's bell tower, Sarah sat with Mr. Thompson on his porch, just like they had done so many times before. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said softly, looking out at the community they had built together. "She always said that healing was like gardening. You plant the seeds of kindness, tend them with patience, and trust that something beautiful will grow." Rachel joined them, bringing out a fresh photo album, not filled with faded memories this time, but with new ones. Pictures of the center's construction, the first community gathering, children reading in Grace's room, and veterans finding peace in James's garden. These new memories were being written alongside the old ones, creating a continuing story of hope and healing. As they flipped through the pages together, Sarah realized that her grandmother's legacy wasn't just in the buildings or programs they created. It was in the connections being formed, the barriers being broken, and the understanding that grew a little stronger each day. The true power of her grandmother's courage wasn't just in what she did in 1963, but in how her actions continued to inspire and guide people to build bridges across divides. The story that began with a simple wave across a fence had blossomed into something far greater than any of them could have imagined. It proved that sometimes the most powerful changes don't come from grand gestures, but from small acts of kindness that ripple through time, touching lives and healing hearts for generations to come.